Thank you very much. Everybody hear me all right? Thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning. It's always fun to be out on a Saturday morning. So I got sort of inspired for this talk at GameSoundCon last year when somebody from the traditional music industry, probably at drinks, had mentioned something about, wow, the audio tools that you have for game audio are really amazing, and they're really bad. And I tried very hard to resist the urge not to wring his neck and explain to him how amazing it is to actually do game audio with tools like Wise and Fmod and Cryware and Fabric and so on, compared to what it used to be like to have when we used to have to do games. But then I was thinking more about what he said, and I think the question was a really, really healthy question for our industry, in that we are at the point where, yeah, the tools, it's time to move on sort of the next generation of tools, I think. And so it got me thinking about how do the tools and technologies impact what we do or limit what we are going to do. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about technology and creativity, and then use a specific case study of something topical, say, virtual reality, sort of as an example. So I want to start off by playing one of my favorite pieces of game audio ever. It's actually just the spoken word. This is John Carmack, who of course is now CTO of Facebook, of Oculus at Facebook. Brilliant, brilliant man. In 2004, he basically said, audio is a solved problem, we can go on and do other things. Here's his quote in full.
Another one that's basically could be done right now is audio. If anybody wanted to spend all the resources that we have today, in terms of using the GPUs for it and all the floating point processing power, audio could be done. I mean, we could go ahead and have all the head modeling, all the the radiosity style sound transfer through very complex environments, and we certainly have the the sample rate and the and the bit depth for all of that. But it just doesn't really pay off in the current generation of things to devote that much effort to it. But given a couple more turns of the processor generations, audio will just be done.
Well, that was 2004. We've had a couple turns of processor generation since then, so we're probably about done. Thanks very much. All right. I don't mean to rag on John. He's stupidly brilliant. But he's viewing audio as a graphics problem, and I think that he's thinking a little bit differently, I think, than we are. Right? John's big assumption, which is certainly the case, has been for the bottleneck of awesome graphics, has been we need more compute cycles, we need more algorithms, we need more math, we need more silicon, and that solves a lot of graphics very hard problems. Not completely, but it's certainly, compared to 2004 and what you can get today, it's obviously night and day. I think one thing that's become pretty clear, looking at the industry over the last couple of 2-3 decades that I've been involved, is that this isn't really the problem that we have. We're not bottlenecked by silicon, I think, like graphics are. Yeah. Now that said, obviously, new technology has always had an impact on creativity for us in music and sound. Going way back, right? This is not unexpected, right? What you can do is going to affect what people do. Even going back, the evolution of the piano. I love Baroque music. It's my favorite genre of classical music. But obviously one of the problems is that you really don't have the ability to play anything more than one dynamic on a harpsichord. So what happened? Engineers started tinkering with things. How can we make it such that we can play both loud and soft, or both soft and loud, both piano and forte? And engineers came up with the pianoforte. 1711 is when Cristofori's pianoforte first hit the market, the first really interesting, usable device. And it obviously did much more than simply allow you to play Baroque-style music at different volume levels, which is something they wanted to be able to do because you could do that with other instruments, like stringed instruments or wind instruments. The technology, not only in loud and soft, but in the kind of virtuosity a player could do, fundamentally changed the characteristics of the art that was created, right? You could play much, much faster on a pianoforte than you could on a harpsichord. Harpsichords kind of got a bit of a clunky action with these plectrums that are going on. So there's a great example of technology trying to solve what the engineers thought was the problem. The harpsichordist says, I'm too soft. They fix it, and then all of a sudden composers can do all these other things. Another great example of that is, of course, the guitar. And since I already gave away the punchline because I clicked too fast, what happened? Dave Davies slit a hole in his speaker, and You Really Got Me Now from 1964 is generally credited to be the beginning of distorted guitar sound in terms of a major hit. Again, if the engineers said, hey, well, this thing will make your guitar louder, but just don't turn it up past about 7 or 8, because then you get these nonlinearities, this distortion, which is really bad. And of course, that totally changed what was going on. Similarly, this little device had a nice impact on the music that was created.
You can't touch this. You can't touch this.
And nowhere does this
Can't touch this.
sort of the impact of technology on the direct art that's created manifests itself much more than this, right? Chiptunes are called chiptunes because of these chips. This is the SID chip up top. The things Rob Hubbard could get out of this SID chip were really quite amazing. And one of my favorite bits of chip technology was done by David Thiel, local here. He had access to an LPC-based speech chip and needed to have some way to make this little character make some noise, and he decided to throw random numbers at it to see what happened, and we ended up with... So that was the voice of Qbert, was random numbers thrown at a speech synthesis chip. Obviously, the chips sort of eventually got better. The Yamaha FM technology, which was invented in the 70s by a professor at Stanford University named John Chowning, licensed by Yamaha. By the way, I believe I read that the Stanford FM synthesis patent is the second largest money-making patent for Stanford University after the birth control pill. So that's how ubiquitous this technology was and how much of an impact it had on industry. Arcade games in the 90s, including consoles like the Sega Genesis, had this technology built into them, and millions and millions and millions of devices, of game devices, were created with this kind of technology. Now, these chips could do kind of cool stuff. This is actually from a pinball machine I did from somewhere in the late 80s, early 90s. But the technology did definitely limit us in terms of the sorts of things we could do. Right. Early game music was melodic for a reason. People sort of lament back to, oh, remember the good old days where video games had themes like Mario and Final Fantasy, and it's like, well, yeah, when your chips can't do much more than triangle waves, square waves, there's not a whole lot of stuff you've got to be able to do. Melody is about all that we really had back then. It was very, very difficult to get emotive, moving performances and textures. Part of this was the timbres that were available. Part of it was the fact that the systems would quantize things like pitch and time. So you couldn't have more granularity than a perfectly synchronized 16th note sometimes. And you also couldn't, by the way, necessarily have an exactly in tune chromatic scale. Some of these chips, if you got too high, the chips would go out of tune because of the technology that happened to be used to create them. But we still do have lots of awesome compositional tools. We've got melody, we've got rhythm, we've got harmony, we've got form, and that's why a lot of those old tunes really rely on those things. Texture, orchestration, timbre, not really so much. Maybe when you started getting into the more complicated FM chips, we could do some of that stuff, but not really. Human performance was also very difficult. Generally, for these systems, all notes had to be entered by hand, and we would go make hand-edited glissandos. A lot of this predates even MIDI. It just is very, very cumbersome to do so. And again, your pitch might be quantized, so you can't have the kind of gliss that a natural trumpet player would, or violinist might make or something like that. Just that little bit of change of pitch of the attack that makes something human instead of something mechanical. So that's one of the reasons that game music was like it was for such a long time. There was a giant innovation that occurred in game audio technology, which I would postulate is the single most important innovation. And it didn't have anything to do with clock cycles and CPU speeds and radiosity calculations. It was the DVD. Prior to the DVD, almost all music in games was forced into being a synthesized sort of chiptune. Even the PlayStation 2 had a synthesizer chip on it to do music as well as sound effects. And people might say, well, what about the compact disc? It's true, the compact disc did give a little teasings of that, but one of the problems was that as systems like the Saturn or the original PlayStation came out, all of a sudden game developers realized, wow, there's a lot more stuff I can put on this compact disc, like dialogue. I did the first version of Madden for PlayStation, and the disc was mostly filled with dialogue from John Madden. There was room for one theme song to be recorded in a studio, and the rest of it was all synthesized on chips. So it really wasn't until the DVD hit, the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox, that there really was enough room on these devices where Marty O'Donnell could go out and record 90 minutes of Halo score with the Chicago Symphony or himself chanting like a monk with folks. And so that was the giant turning point. But even then, that enabled one bit of game audio technology to, again, make a titanic shift. And this wasn't just aesthetically, but this affected the business of game audio. Because prior to essentially DVD and PlayStation, to be in game audio, you kind of had to be a little bit of a nerd head and be, the things that Rob Hubbard did with the SID chip were amazing because he could go and program 6502 assembly language to make it do these things. Not a whole lot of people could do that kind of stuff. Rob Hubbard could. When the DVD hit, and when now in order to make music for games, you no longer needed that skill set, but you did need the same skill set you needed to compose a feature film, you started having a lot of people from more traditional media, television, movies, jingles, 10 million strong and growing. Everybody knows that. Nobody knows that anymore? Oh, Marty. These kids, they're not Flintstone kids. So people like Marty O'Donnell, who came doing jingles, expertise in traditional orchestra recording and production, were able to get into games. So that probably is the most titanic shift. Another thing we sort of learned is that even if you do build it, if you build awesome technology, they might come if you make it really easy for them to use. Otherwise, they might not. They probably won't. We learned this lesson on the original Xbox. We had pretty awesome sound chip on the original Xbox. It was sort of Pro Tools on a chip plus a 256 voice sample cell synthesizer. And, you know, as Xbox developers, we had direct sound that programmers could use to play sounds. We extended the direct sound API, the programming interface, to allow the entire functionality of that chip to become available to game developers to use, filters and all this HRTF and cool stuff. And pretty much nobody used it. And the problem was is that the people who knew what to do with it, the composers and sound designers, were not the people who had access to be able to do it, which were the programmers working at a very low level at this direct sound API level. And because of that, we had what we believed was a true competitive advantage over the PlayStation that was being massively underutilized. We got the go-ahead to create something called XACT, the Xbox Audio Creation Tool, which was designed to it was a GUI interface that lets sound designers and composers access the cool features of these chips in a cool custom UI, so the programmers wouldn't have to worry about what it meant to change the filter from the one-pole filter to the resident musician's filter, or to add reverb to sounds, or roll off sounds with distance and so on. So that was very, very cool, and that was very empowering. It was, you know, this predates WISE by a couple years. We were very, very proud of it. But then we sort of learned something accidentally along the way, and sort of ironic, because we put these cool tools in front of the composers and sound designers, and in an interesting way, we kind of almost got less creative. We got a lot more creative in that we let people access these things, but we got less creative because we were only doing those things that the tool people were only doing those things that we happened to enable them to do in this tool. So the big irony is that production values went through the roof, right? I can go record the London Philharmonic at Abbey Road if I want to. Some of the innovation kind of went by the wayside. And one example of that I like to point out is something as simple as randomization. I have probably given 200 talks on game audio where I've talked about how you should randomize your sounds. Randomizing sounds is bad, or it's not bad. Randomizing sounds is a cheat, and I think we need to realize that it's a cheat, because the real world is not random. And if we're doing diegetic sound design for games and we want sounds to be intentional and be real, and I think this is amplified more by VR, which is why we're starting to think about these things. Since the world isn't random, if I see non-randomness in my VR visuals, but I'm hearing randomness of audio, that's a problem, that's a mistake. Now, sometimes randomization is appropriate, right? If I've got a landmine blowing up, obviously there's some physics there that has to do with the unequal random distribution of gunpowder and the imperfections of the shell casing. By all means, use a random thing for that. But I think we get lulled into complacency that these random containers, these tools make randomization so easy that we forget that what we're really trying to do is use randomization as a proxy for the fact that the real world doesn't behave the same way all the time. So with randomization, just say sometimes to random containers or multi-sounds if you're in Fmod. I think physics-influenced audio is a little bit more of how we want to be going, but we don't have tools that make that really easy, so we don't do it, because the tools have made it so easy to be random. And I've told people for 15 years how good random is, and I'm thinking, it's good, but just be careful when you go there. Another issue with games is sometimes you just need to code, and we need to recognize that sometimes you just need to code. We talk about a game isn't a WAV file, a game sound is not a WAV file, obviously still maintaining that. But I would go farther and saying a game sound is not even a middleware event, right? A middleware event can be this complex layering of 5 different sounds playing with random pitches and volumes, physically influenced pitches and volumes, streaming or not with filters and all this other cool stuff. But that even itself may only be part of a larger picture. I recently finished / I'm in the middle of, I miss the times when games used to be done. Games, you'd work on them and then be done, and then you'd go to the next one. Now you work on it and it's done, and then you still work on it. So I do a football game called Mutant Football League, and it's got an interactive crowd sound, obviously. Now the crowd sound is not a simple FMOD event. It's about 60 different FMOD events and 5 or 6 pages of spec that tell the programmer when they should play this event, when they should play this event. When should you, there's a FMOD event for when the quarterback throws the ball. There's an FMOD event for when the player catches the ball. There's an FMOD event for when the player dives for the ball. And these, I'm not talking about the sound effects. These are the crowd reaction sounds to what's going on in the game. So this abstract notion of my crowd sound is a combination of multiple FMOD events, a whole lot of them, and these instructions how to do it. That's my sound. And right now, the tools really don't let us make those kind of sounds very easily. They let us make the components, which is awesome, right? There's a bed of a crowd sound with an RTPC on it, but a crowd sound with a single RTPC on it for its intensity level is a really, really average crowd sound. So, have these tools sort of lulled us into a bit of complacency? Was John Carmack correct? Have we gotten, is everything there? Will things like HRTFs, which he called head modeling and radiosity calculations, mean that we're pretty much done? So let's take a look at one particular example of technology and do a little bit deeper dive into VR. And take a look at that from a technology standpoint and see how maybe it influences us. And I'm trying to think if there's anybody in this room who has not seen me play this game before. I need a volunteer and a chair.
Here's the chair. We still need a volunteer.
Yes, volunteer, back there. All right. Yeah, just do it right here. I'm going to sit you right there. What's your name?
Jess.
Jess, Brian. How you doing, Jess? All right. This is called the Snap My Fingers game. It's not very difficult. You close your eyes, honor system. I'm going to snap my fingers, and you point to where I'm snapping. Understand the rules? You want me to go over them again? No. All right. All right. Ready? Make a big gesture again, same gesture you just did. Open your eyes.
Oh, damn.
Thank you. All right. That works about 70% of the time. So it worked that time. What's the point of this? When we talk about 3D audio, and I've been studying 3D audio since about the early 80s. I had the good fortune with studying with some early researchers in that. We talk about the big three. What are the things that we use to localize sound? IID, ITD, HRTF. We've talked about this at previous symposiums. I won't go over them in detail. IID means the sound interaural intensity difference. The sound is louder in the ipsilateral ear than the contralateral ear. ITD means it gets to one ear before the other. And HRTF, of course, is the funny filtering that gets done on sounds as they bounce off parts of our outer ear. Well, that's really the big 3 plus 1, because we do add reverberant field into that helps with our distance perception and so on. And these are really what, there's been a lot of work done, especially in the last 3 years or so, on these technologies. And this is what part of what John Carmack was referring to was the head modeling and radiosity calculations. I think it was almost 5 years ago now, I created a game for the iPhone just to see what it was like. I want to do an audio game. And I used a technology, an HRTF engine from a company called QSound that wasn't actually commercially released, but I got a hold of it. At that time, it was the only HRTF engine you could get for any mobile device. Since then, we've had companies like Visisonics, Two Big Ears, Phonon. What's the company behind Phonon? They got bought by Steam. There's G Audio. There's Blue Ripple. There's a lot of companies that do this sort of processing technology. But we're obviously really bad at it. We have a hard, as demonstrated here, I snapped my fingers here, and the finger went backwards. So the big three, +1 for reverb, and I'll add another +1 for head tracking. As you move your head, you get sort of multiple sets of ears, and so you can triangulate things a little bit more easily. So I want to talk about why we're so bad at it, and then think about how should this affect the technologies that we're working on and using. So why are we so bad at picking out where a sound is in 3D space? Part of it has to do with the, actually, not part of it, all of it has to do with the physiology and psychoacoustics of how we see and how we hear. If I see a bird, literally at the back of my retina is an upside-down picture of the world as I see it, as I'm looking at it. And at the back, especially right here, there's a heavy concentration of nerve cells, of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Those rods and cones are directly connected to nerves. So in a sense, if you think about it, there's a real world out there, a literal photographic type image on the back of my eyeball, directly stimulating rods and cones, light receptor cells, that directly stimulate nerve cells. So I have a neural mapping of the physical world directly. It's a one-to-one correspondence there. Whoops. Contrast that to hearing now. When we hear something, sound goes into our ears. It kind of gets mixed with all the other sounds that are there. Hits the eardrum, hits the stanval, the stapes, malleus, and starts vibrating fluids that are in our ear that have hair cells in them. And I'll get to that in just a second. Whoops. Now, part of the reason we aren't good at detecting the location of a sound is because there isn't this kind of mapping of the location of a sound directly onto neural receptors like we have for vision. The best that we can do in our ears is detect the amplitude and frequency content of whatever the sum total of all sounds are mixed in the air hitting our eardrums are. And we can detect how they change in time. That's two good things. And we can compare input from our two sensors, right, our two ears. And that's really about it. This is a picture of an unrolled cochlea. And I know that JJ has talked about this, so I won't go about this in big detail. But essentially, the cochlea, which is where our nerve receptors are, performs essentially a manual FFT, a mechanical FFT on sounds. And that's how we can figure out what frequencies are there. But since all we are able to do is determine the spectral and temporal content of the sounds, we have to infer things like location from these things that we can get. And we're simply not very good at doing this because we're not designed to be. I'm going to jump back a couple things. And as a takeaway, sound is much more like peripheral vision than it is what's called gaze vision. Gaze vision is if I'm looking right at Lawrence's nose, the most densely concentrated rods and cones and neural receptors are right. There's a great picture of Lawrence's nose in the back of my eyeball right now. Let me get rid of that image. But if I'm looking over here at Max, I can barely tell who that is. I can tell that it's a roughly human shape. Now, our brain does a really good job of making us think our vision is way better than it is. This is the Supreme Court here on the right is more of how our vision system works. And if you really pay attention and test out your peripheral vision, you can actually kind of find this to be true by trying to read something that is here. You just can't do it. We don't have the visual acuity to do it. Now, what is the peripheral vision system really good at doing? Detecting motion. Why? Because if there was something over there that was moving, like a bear, and I don't need to know that it's a bear, but I need to know something's moving. And if I see something moving, I can gaze at it, and now I can see, oh my goodness, that's a bear, I'd better go the other way. So in a sense, our ears were designed to act peripherally. They have the great advantage, though, that it's not limited to my field of view. Right? We have two senses that work at a distance with low latency. Our sight and sound. Smell and touch, those are not distant. Smell is distant, but it's really slow because the smell's got a problem. If you had to smell the bear before you could run away from it, we probably wouldn't be here. Touch obviously has to be close. If you can touch the bear before you know it's there, then we're really in trouble. But I can hear the bear. I don't need to know precisely where it is, but I've got a sense that's finely tuned to know exactly where things are. And as long as my peripheral sense, my hearing, lets me know roughly where it is, I can tune my eyes to it and now know, oh, that's just John, or that's just Grog. I don't have to worry about running away from Grog. But if I hear a lion stalking in the grass, I know to run away from that. So I think sometimes we get hung up on trying to treat sound as a gaze sense and not a peripheral sense. And that can be a real big problem as we're trying to do realistic VR simulations of stuff. And I know it can be a problem when we're trying to set our expectations for what technology enables us to do, right? I had the example here, I forgot your name, Jesse? Jess. If I snap my fingers in front of Jess and he thinks the sound is behind him, in the actual universe, this is not a simulation, well, unless the universe is a simulation, and we'll watch the Discovery Channel for that one. In the actual universe with Jess's actual ears, the sound was here and he pointed here. How can we calibrate expectations for digital simulation of 3D audio when in the real universe we're not actually all that good to it? Now, fortunately, our 3D sound has been somewhat well characterized over the decades. Right, our sound perception, our ability to localize sound relatively accurately has been characterized decently well. In the front, we're fairly good. If Lawrence I were to close my eyes and Lawrence were to say something, and I'm kind of looking in front of him, I could locate him within about 7-degree arc, plus or minus 3-4 degrees, something like that. And that's directly in front. To the side, the blur is about 10 degrees each way, so a total of about 20 degrees, something like that. I'm sorry, 5 or 6 degrees each way, a total of 10 or 11 degrees error. And again, this has been characterized in academic literature fairly well. Now, one interesting point is even at our very most precise ability to localize by sound, we're still 3 orders of magnitude worse than visuals. If I am a human with 20/20 vision, I have a visual discrepancy. I can discern visual discrepancies of about 1 millimeter at 6 meters. That's 20/20 vision. At 6 meters, if you do the math, that works out to almost a meter, about 75 centimeters is 6 meters and 7 degrees. So again, that's about 3 orders of magnitude worse in localization, comparing our most accurate sound localization with our most accurate visual localization. And again, I think that gets us into trouble. because we assume that audio is a sense that has gaze-level accuracy like our sight does, and it just doesn't. And Ivan Teshev, who's speaking at AVAR, has kind of characterized this as, humans are kind of really 2.5D sound creatures, not really 3D. Right? On the horizontal plane, we're not so bad. Vertical, we can get pretty bad, where the error range is really quite large, plus or minus 22 degrees. And we're so bad at it that I'm always confident enough to do this demo live. I did this demo at GDC in front of 200 people, did it at MIGS in front of 7 people. I'll do it here again today because it turns out people are more likely to get it wrong than they are to get it right. And likewise, distance we're not really that great at either. We have a tendency as humans to skew our estimated distance. This particular graph, again, this is not simulation, this is not HRTF or reverb modeling. This puts actual sound sources at actual distances, that's the straight line, and then asks people how far away they think the sound source is. So as sounds are too close, they think they're farther away. As sounds are farther away, they think they're too close. That's just how we hear. And this has been characterized more. It changes with speech or music or noise or things like that. And there's this is another interesting demo I'd kind of like to play. This is proximal distal distinction in audio stimuli in hirsute caeruleum prodigium. To talk about other kinds of cues we use to determine distance.
Hello there. This is your old pal Grover. And today I'm going to talk to you about near and far. In fact, I, little furry Grover, am going to show you near and far. Okay, here goes. First, this is near. Right here, near. This is far. This is near. You see? Oh, okay, I'll do it once more for you, okay? Okay. This is near. This is far.
He does that a couple more times. I love that because the people at Sesame Street Workshop obviously paid attention to sound. So what happens when he gets farther away? He gets softer, he gets more reverberant, and those definitely are cues that we use in distance. And when I'm giving this lecture to my BSc SDA students or the BMSD students, I sort of say, what else has changed? They're like, oh, he gets more muffled. That's true, air packs a little bit of a low-pass filter, and they emulate that in the Sesame Street video. I think that's awesome. And about half the time they get the last one, which I think is the most interesting one. When Grover is far away, his voice is soft, but he's shouting. And when he's nearby, he's not shouting. And that actually turns out to be a huge distance cue. We spend our entire lives learning what the sound of a human voice is at different distance levels. And this is one of the there's been studies with blind from birth people, blind after birth people, and fully sighted people. People who are blind from birth do worse generally at distance sound, figuring out how far something is based on sound, including human voice. People who were blind after adulthood are much more likely to be able to determine the distance of a human voice based upon the sound because it's something they've learned. And if I'm speaking up close to somebody, I'm going to be talking nice and softly. If I'm trying to talk to Jesse in the back and I don't have the help of an amplifier, I'm going to have a raised voice. And I'm sorry, no HRTF filter or digital signal processing filter in the world is going to change the character of my voice from a normal spoken voice to a voice trying to get across information to Marty, who's, 12 rows back, in any kind of meaningful way. So these learned natures of sounds themselves, again, human voice is an especially good example of that. Another example, which both Google and Microsoft have reported, is they have a heck of a time trying to get a chirping bird to sound from down below. They both have said, we've got these great HRTF filters, you take a noise pulse through it, it'll be, minus 70 degrees, right down here, you can practically see it. Taking a bird sound, putting it through the exact same filter, and people hear the bird up here. So this preconception of, and our expectations through learned experience, right? Our ears did not evolve in isolation. They evolved along with our other senses and along with human experience. If I don't see an obvious source of sound, chances are you will localize it behind me. That's why the finger snap test works. Their eyes are closed, they hear a sound, they have no obvious visual source of the sound, the tendency is to localize it behind it. I suppose that's because, if you don't see something and you hear something, you'd run in the direction where you don't see anything, and the person who didn't hear like that stayed where they were or ran the other way into the bear's hungry chompers. I've done a lot of 3D audio demos, and sometimes people who start to implement audio, either in games or VR experiences, start to think, why do 3D audio demos sound so much better than 3D audio games? And part of that is we're really good at cheating. I mean, being creative. And we know somewhat about how hearing works. We know that HRTFs have these big frequency notches in the upper, in the 6 kilohertz, there's one notch, there's another one at about 11 or 12 kilohertz. And so we know if we want HRTF to be able to grab onto a sound and really do something to it, we make sure there's a lot of frequency content up there. So we pick our sounds to take maximum advantage of the audio technologies that we're trying to sell or demonstrate. High frequency content if I want elevation to be significant. And we play on preconceptions like nobody's business. There's a reason that helicopters are really, really common in 3D audio. They're big, fat, broad sounds, and there's a kind of a preconception that they're up and they're away. Trains are naturally distant sound in a lot of recordings. Judicious use of visuals, motion, and placement. Virtual haircut, if you notice, there is never a time in virtual haircut where they try to put a sound in front of the listener, because without head tracking, again, virtual haircut was done around 92, I think, when I was consulting for Q-Sound. And without head tracking, you can't get a good front image over headphones, almost no matter how hard you try. So we didn't. It's like, let's focus on left and right, and right up near here, which HRTF actually does a very good job on. Also, in virtual haircut, it's sort of like Grover saying that he was far. The barber in virtual haircut says, and now I'm going to put the bag over your head and snip off your left ear, or whatever he says. So in a sense, these sorts of things that John Carmack was talking about, modeling, radiosity, those really aren't going to solve all our problems. Now, I'm not saying they're not important technologies. They are. You take them away and something's missing. Definitely a feeling of space, externalization, all these things. But this kind of math maybe isn't necessarily the right thing. By the way, this is a picture of from the WISE website about 3 months ago. And this talks about using the image source modeling of early reflections in a shoebox room, right? That's where you model a reflection off a wall as if there were another sound source out in another room. This picture on the right is essentially a picture of the same thing. This picture on the right is from the Kendall Martin's, I think it's 1983 patent. Gary Kendall is a professor at Northwestern University. He did a lot of early work taking the work of Blauert and so on and codifying them into computer programs that actually modeled, I forgot how many reflections they modeled this way. It may have been 4 or 5. It was quite a number of reflections. And they actually wrote a piece of software that ran on a little mini mainframe that would do this calculation. And I actually was very fortunate to have been an undergraduate under Professor Kendall. He's the reason I got into music technology in the first place. And we were contracted by CBS when they remade the Twilight Zone TV series to create a 3D sound version of the opening credits for the Twilight Zone. So Mickey Hart from the Grateful Dead was the sound designer composer for it. It was a very music concrete kind of thing. And I think we could play 8 tracks, if I recall. We had a little text file that would say what the sound is and what the trajectory was over what period of time, what degrees. And it would go through and it would do all those calculations. And if I recall correctly, in full run mode, full fidelity mode, I think the opening was 60 seconds, and we'd say, go. And we'd come back about 2 days later and listen to the computed wave file, which was the result of the mixing and HRTF panning of all this stuff. So that was one thing that has changed. You can obviously do that in real time on an iPhone now, and it used to take 2 days of compute power of a $100,000 mini mainframe. So I would say that the big 3 is missing a lot. We talk about ILD, ITD, HRTF, reverberant field. Those are the traditional John Carmack-esque solutions to spatialization. But you've got to add preconceptions, learned behavior, visual fusion. If I see an object making a sound source, I'm going to hear that sound source there. I was at Disneyland recently, Pirates of the Caribbean ride. You're going through and you can see the mouth move, and I know the speaker is in that rock. But I hear it coming out of the guy's mouth. I tried closing my eyes, and actually, if I closed my eyes, I kind of could hear it coming from where I knew it was coming from. But even though I knew the sound was there, seeing the animatronic mouth gave me the perception of the voice coming from this guy's mouth, or this animatronic guy's mouth. So I think an issue that we have sometimes is an over-reliance on raw technology to address creative issues really is in some sense serving the wrong problem. And that as awesome as these tools are, and I mean no disrespect to the FMOD folks or the WISE folks or the Fabrics folks, they've made amazing tools that have made game audio orders of magnitude better than it has ever been before. But it does kind of limit what you find yourself trying out. So I'm going to make sort of a postulation. At this stage of the game, concentrating too much or exclusively on the right side of the diagram, which is the non-physics stuff, might have more bang for the buck than worrying about the details of radiosity and wave tracing. Now, there's a great demo on the WISE website right now. It's not about 3D, but it's a really cool example of, they've recorded a little Jeep scene. And they've got 2 characters in this Jeep scene having a dialogue with each other. And the way they've set it up is they've chopped each line of dialogue into like 2-word chunks. And they've recorded 3 different performances of each line of dialogue. One they call mezzo piano, one they call mezzo forte, and one they call forte. And what this demo does is, as the Jeep is playing, you can hear the Jeep sound. Well, the Jeep engine sound is going into a metering effect tied to an RTPC. So now the game knows how loud that Jeep sound is. That RTPC is then used to set a switch container change. If the volume of the Jeep is very soft, then the soft versions of the dialogue are played. If the volume of the Jeep is a higher level, but still not really loud, then the dialogue jumps from the soft dialogue up to the sort of medium level dialogue, because the characters in the Jeep are trying to overcome the noise of the Jeep. And of course, if the Jeep is full throttle going, okay, I don't do good Jeep noise, then Wise sets the switch container to play back the dialogue from essentially the shouted version of the dialogue. And it does this at two-word granularity, so that if in the middle of a sentence one of the characters is speaking softly, but then you floor the Jeep and it jumps up to being really loud, in the middle of a sentence, now the player character is shouting the remainder of their lines of dialogue instead of merely speaking them. It's possible. It's really, really, really cumbersome to do that. But that, just like Grover, will probably give you a much more convincing distance effect than relying on a shoebox model of a room, especially if you're outside. What shoebox model do you put for an outside room? So our tools and research, I think, are focused a little bit too much on the left side, and we need to enable some more of these sorts of things that are on the right side, that play on the psychoacoustics, the preconceptions of how we're doing it, right? So like the piano, we don't want to rely on new technology to solve these problems. And the technology can create these doors, but then we're sometimes at the risk of only going into those doors, when what we really should do is, take a chainsaw to the wall and go and see what's behind that wall. Imagine if all that the piano had been ever used for was to take the music of Bach, which is my very favorite composer, so I don't mean to diss Bach, but if that's all we did was play Bach, but now with dynamic levels, obviously we'd be much, much poorer as a species. Or what if the guitar amp just made classical guitar louder, right? Where did the rock guitar sound come from? I thought this was apocryphal, but I found this interview with Dave Davies, and he said, I don't know, I was always into science fiction and science. This is, why did you take a razor blade to your speaker amp? Anyway, one night, I just got really frustrated with my amp sound. Every amp sounded the same. I got really, really fed up. I didn't think I'd actually done anything. I just shaved it a bit. So I plugged into my AC30, and it really came to life. It was essentially the first effects pedal, was taking a razor blade to the speaker in his amp, because he was tired of sounding like everybody else. He wanted something kind of new. And that obviously changed music, again, in a different way. The fuzz pedal hadn't been invented yet. That came after this, as engineers tried to figure out ways to duplicate this razor blade to the speaker sound without actually taking a razor blade to your speaker. They came out with the fuzz box, which was not that successful until the Stones used it in Satisfaction, and then sort of the rest is history. So, sort of wrap things up, the tech we provide has a really huge impact on the kind of things we do creatively. And let's be careful that they don't define what we do and just let us experiment and do some cool stuff. And maybe it's time for us to slash a few speakers. We've had these tools for a little bit. It's time to, I hope that's not a DigiPen inappropriate picture now that I think about it. It's a speaker, it's a speaker. So, thank you very much, I appreciate it.
On the handheld. Do we have a few minutes, maybe 3 or 4 minutes for questions from the audience? If you want to ask questions, raise your hand. I'm going to dart over to you with a mic.
Oh, we need the mic because of the live streaming.
Yeah, this is for the live stream, so that's really worth it.
Hey, I want to get your perspective on something. The postulation you said at the end, where sometimes ignoring what actually physically happens in the real world is a good thing, reminded me, I think it was like GDC 3 years ago, there was an audio presentation on Destiny, and there was a rocket launch sound, And from far away, they actually did a high-pass filter instead of a low-pass filter, which I guess like is the opposite of what happened in real life, right? And it sounded really good, and somebody asked that same question, like, you know, why did you make that choice? And I was going to ask you, like, do you often find it's a good, like, how often do you find yourself making choices that are not just sort of disregarding physics, but like actually doing the opposite of what you think would happen audio-wise for like a creative effect?
Oh, I don't have to repeat the question because it's on the mic. That's great. I mean, you're always at the end of the day, it's what's coming out of the speakers. And actually, in that particular case, I would make a case that they may have been more accurate to physics than we think. When we talk about error acts at a low-pass filter, that's kind of an oversimplification. It actually kind of acts as a bandpass filter. So it does get rid of some lows, and there is sort of a high-passy component to it. But yeah, I mean, if right, again, our hearing is very complex, and it might be that, you know, the Destiny folks stumbled onto some bit of psychoacoustics that our brain just latched onto that made that particular processing of the sound feel very distant as it was coming towards you. So I'm not sure I'd use that as an example of being opposite, because there is a low-pass filtering, a high-pass filtering effect of error as well. But in terms of where things are opposite,
I guess that's not a great way to phrase it. Maybe doing something that seems counterintuitive to find a better solution than what you think it might be.
Yeah, I'm sure that other folks in this room probably can think of. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Actually, I take that back. There are a couple things that, again, the football game I was just finishing working on, which was also something similarly done in the movie True Lies, is sometimes deliberately being incorrect from mismatching the camera perspective versus the aural perspective. There's a scene in True Lies where they're on the bridge at the end. It's a 30-year-old movie, so no spoilers. No spoiler alert here. There's an explosion on the bridge, and the camera is, 100 feet back, 200 feet back. So it's a third-person perspective of the bridge. But the explosion sound, you're right in the middle of it in 5.1. So it's first-person audio mismatched with third-person visuals, and it works great because it's using audio to build you in. And I have the same thing with tackle sounds in this football game. The very final tackle of every play is not 3D positioned where you see it on the screen. It's a stereo sound. You're right in the middle of it. So I think that kind of mismatching between first camera perspective and audio camera perspective maybe is something. It'd be interesting to see if that works at all in VR. I don't know if that would work, but good question, yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Just a comment though, what about the time delay? When you see the explosion, there's not always a delay in games or films because it feels better if they're in sync.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alistair. Obviously, a couple of games, every 3 or 4 years, a game tries to model accurate sound propagation. And every 3 or 4 years, people realize, wow, that really makes it sound broken. And I think there's a psychological component to that as well. If you think about it, the vast majority of your sound experience in your life are for sounds that are within about 60 or 70 feet, right? Once in a while, you'll be watching a football game and seeing somebody kick a ball from, 400 feet away. But that's not the usual experience. The 99.5% experience is the sound of a coffee cup, and it's here, it gets to me within about 4 or 5 milliseconds. So I think we have this notion of sound-sight synchronization drilled into us for so long that it's an unusual experience to experience the proper lag of a sound. And you add to that the fact that most game engines, the audio engines, have a built-in latency on top of it. And so we're sort of adding unintended latency anyway. That I think that is kind of one of the reasons why game audio always seems to sound broken when you try to accurately model the speed of sound. I'm sure there's some app where it works really well that I'm not aware of, but I just haven't seen any yet.
Okay, so I'm a little embarrassed to ask this question, but for me and maybe other young people in the room, who is Rob Hubbard, and why should I listen to it, or what should I listen to of him to get excited about?
Oh my goodness, who is Rob? Rob Hubbard was the sound designer, composer at Electronic Arts in its very early founding days. He did amazing work for C64. He was the master of the SID chip. If you just Google Rob Hubbard, he has an honorary doctorate from, I forget for where he went to school, for his contributions to game audio. He just could, I had the good fortune of working on a game with him, Desert Strike, where he and I both, he did some of the analog stuff and I did the FM stuff. And he would just, because of his programming skills, he could get so much awesome sound out of these chips that had no business making these cool sounds. He would, change the pitch on them dozens of times a second. He would modulate the noise generator in weird, funky ways, just spewing data at these chips to get cool sounds out of them. So yeah, definitely look up Rob Hubbard. You Google him, you'll find all sorts of stuff that he's done.